In this video, we'll have a look at determining VAT in the cash payments journal. So let's analyze the transactions that we have been given. So on the 11th of the month, we paid T Able Limited by check to the amount of 5988 and received a discount of 342. So in the first instance, it's saying that we paid an amount. It was to T Able Limited and it was to the amount of 5988. So this tells us, first of all, that there's money leaving the business, which of course affects our bank account. We paid T Able Limited, which tells us, of course, that this was a creditor who we owed money. Then we received a discount to the amount of 342. So that, of course, affects our discount column. And then finally, we need to determine the VAT portion and whether this was VAT input or output. So we can immediately write the amount of 5988 into the bank account, because that was the physical amount of money that left our bank account. Then we need to determine what the amount was that we initially owed the creditor, because the creditor gave us a discount on the payment of the amount of 5988. So the original amount would then, of course, be the 5988 plus the 342 discount that we received, which then gives us an amount of 6330. Then our discount was 342, and then we need to determine whether this was VAT input or output. So we can think of this in terms of the flow of product. So this was a supplier that we were paying. So the initial sale that occurred was, of course, the flow of products into our business, which tells us that initially there was VAT input involved. We need to then reverse that VAT input, and we do that, of course, by applying an amount to the VAT output. So our VAT output would then be 342 multiplied by 14 divided by 114. And that gives us the amount of 42 Rand. So there we have all our values, and all that's left to do now is to add that into our cash payments journal. So the date of the transaction was the 11th. The details for this account is T Able Limited, because that is, of course, the creditor that is affected. Our bank account was the amount of 5988. This was the creditor's account that was affected with the original amount of the debt that was owed by our company. So that was 6330. And then, of course, the discount that we received. And then we determined that this was the VAT output. So let's have a look at the next transaction. On the 12th of the month, we purchased merchandise by check from A Plus to the value of 2394. So we know that this was purchases, and the purchases were made from A Plus to the value of 2394. Let's change the color so that we don't get confused. Alright, so let's determine the ledger accounts that are applicable for this transaction. We know, of course, that this was money leaving the bank account, so we know that our bank ledger account is affected. We know that this was purchases. And then, of course, we need to determine the VAT portion and whether this was VAT input or output. So we can immediately fill in the value of 2394 into our bank account, because that was the physical amount of money that left the account. Then our purchases account, we need to work out the value or the difference between the VAT portion and the amount that actually left the bank account. So firstly, we need to determine whether this was input or output. So in terms of the flow of the products, we can have a look at, in terms of the merchandise flowing into the business, we of course know that this is a VAT input, because our supplier was the business that added the value to the merchandise, and they are, of course, liable to the revenue service for that portion of the VAT. So we then claim VAT input on the portion of this amount. So we work that out by saying 2394 multiplied by 14 over 114. So 2394 multiplied by 14 divided by 114. So the VAT portion in this case was then 294 Rand. The purchases then would then be the initial value including VAT minus our 294 Rand, which leaves us with 2,100. And then of course we just need to add this into our cash payments journal. So the date of the transaction was the 12th. In this case, we're dealing with the supplier A plus. So that will be then filled in under the details column. Our bank account was the value of 2394. Purchases we determined to the value of 2,100. And then of course this was a VAT input to the amount of 294 Rand. So let's do the final transaction. So in the final transaction, we paid water and electricity to the amount of 2394 to the City Council. So let's determine the ledger accounts applicable in this case. We know that this was a payment made, so of course that immediately tells us that we are dealing with the bank account. It was made to water and electricity, so we'll abbreviate that to WE, and this would then be a sundry account in the cash payments journal. And then finally, we need to determine the VAT portion of that amount and whether this was an input or an output. So in terms of the flow of the product or the service that we are dealing with in this case, we know that the value was added by the City Council. So this would then mean that it was an inflow of a service, and that then of course says that this was VAT input. So then we can fill in the values. So the bank account was 2394. Our VAT input portion would then be 2394 multiplied by 14 and divided by 114, which would then be the same as the previous example, which was 294 Rand. And then of course, same as the previous example, the water and electricity account would then be the amount excluding the VAT portion, which was 2394 minus 294, and that leaves us with 2,100. So let's fill that in on the cash payments journal. So the transaction was on the 14th of the month. We know that the details, this was to the City Council. The amount affecting our bank account was 2394. This was, of course, a sundries account expenditure, so that would be under the sundries accounts section where we worked out that the amount was 2,100. That was for water and electricity. And then our VAT portion, which we determined to be a VAT input, was then 294. So I hope that you guys noticed that I made a mistake during the second transaction. So this is something that is obviously very easy to do in accounting because of all the different columns and all the different amounts that need to be entered. So this 294 Rand VAT input is of course supposed to be in this column.